Dear friends, thank you for the opportunity to share with you in today's panel, and to Dr. Natalia Cherry for coordinating, and to the panelists that I'm sharing with today. I'm truly grateful to be able to do this, and I'm so sorry that I can't be with you in person in beautiful Denver. I'm currently on research leave, on sabbatical, and I'm a guest professor at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And unfortunately, I can't travel to the United States just at the moment. But I am grateful to be able to share a Southern African Methodist perspective on the decolonizing of biblical scholarship, or post-colonial biblical scholarship, with you. Now, as agreed with the other panelists, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present my input under three specific questions or headings that relate to the description of this unit in the program book, and more or less 5 or 6 minutes for each of those, and then I'll pause in between each of them. So there should be some natural breaks. If the video gets played in its entirety, that's why there will be some short pauses. So let's begin with the first question, which is about the decolonizing of biblical scholarship within various contexts and hermeneutics, particularly those of the global South. Now, I've been working on the decolonization of the African archive in biblical scholarship for some time, and I've taken my leads from the pioneering work of persons such as Itumeleng Musala, an early South African Methodist theologian who shaped this field, the really important work of Gerald West from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who wrote that wonderful book, The Stolen Bible, colleague Musa Dube, and then more recently scholars such as Charlene van der Walt and Ntozake Pezula. Now, in order to address this first topic, what I would like to do is dwell on a few questions that shape my thinking that I think might be pertinent to our discussion. Now, the first thing that I wrestle with when I think about the decolonization of biblical scholarship in my context is the question, to whom does the Bible belong? Or perhaps more pointedly, in what ways are the Bible and its texts do they have a sense of belonging in the various publics of theology? And here I take David Tracy's typology of the public of the theological academy, the public of the church, and the public of society at large. Now, behind this question is not only the issue of hermeneutics, how we interpret and understand texts, there's also for me an ethical question. You see, all of us, I think, would agree that there are ethical implications to the study and interpretation of sacred texts. And as academic scholars, we need to recognize that our interpretations, as well as the interpretations of those whom we study, are already ethically laden. Miguel de la Torre, in his book Ethics from the Margins, noted that the classroom is indeed a room of class. And I'm often struck by the configuration of class, economic class, educational class, and how it functions in academic institutions. And I recognize that somehow, because people like me are funded, because we are given time to do research, because we have resources like books, access to the internet, the ability to travel, because we've had the privilege of formal training. Many of us have studied ancient languages. We've been taught critical thinking, historiography. We, the academic readers of the Bible, often assume that we have a reserve on biblical scholarship and interpretation. But of course, that's not true. We are not purveyors of meaning or the fount of knowledge when it comes to the Bible. Indeed, as Jurgens Hendricks, the South African theologian, has often said, we would be wise to recognize that we do not hold the truth as much as the truth holds us. So that is my first question. What is the reserve of biblical scholarship when viewed from an ethical perspective that critically acknowledges the inherent power balances between the different publics that engage the Bible to find meaning? Now, it's important that I am critical of myself. As you can see, I'm a white, English-speaking male. I'm heterosexual. And of course, I have this privileged position of serving at a university. And so my embodiment, my training, the biases and privileges associated with my person and my social location need to be held very critically. And I think there is sadly a tendency for many of us to try and defend what gives us power. and we'll speak about that a little bit later. But what really inspired me in thinking about how different readers read the text was the work of the Ujamaa Center at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So Gerald West, who I mentioned earlier, Setembiso Zwane and Charlene van der Walt are doing amazing work with ordinary readers of the Bible who also have a legitimate claim on the text. And they are using the text to provide hope and meaning and address real concerns in their lives. Now, this work began originally with the Ujamaa Center when they were working against the heresy of apartheid. Now, lest we forget, it was trained theologians, pastors and professors who were the ones who perpetuated colonial thinking and apartheid theology in contexts such as ours. As has often been said by people like Mitri Raheb, for example, the Palestinian theologian, often it's the trained theologians who provide the software, the forms of thinking, the sort of moral sanction that allows the hardware of political institutions to perpetuate abuse. So let me end this section by telling you a little story. It comes from Gerald West's book, The Stolen Bible, and it's how he got the name for his book. He writes, I quote, "In 1933, Isaiah Shembe, an illiterate and itinerant preacher, a healer, a baptizer, and a prophet, and a founder of a flourishing African-initiated church, tells of how he and his conquered people stole the Bible from the conqueror and used it to restore their community." Now, this, I think, is one of the things that we need to hold on to. To whom does the Bible belong? And what is our role as trained, formal academic theologians in dealing with this particular power imbalance? Okay, let me answer one more question and then I'll be done with this first section. So not only do I ask to whom does the Bible belong, but the second thing that I think is important for us in decolonial contextual biblical scholarship is to ask the question, what counts as knowledge in Bible scholarship? Now, I'm particularly interested to find out how the centering of ordinary readers, in fact, Gerald West calls them extraordinary readers, might change the way in which we study, understand, and utilize texts of the Bible. In this sense, we are interested in what we call knowledge from below, and analysis that is informed by the epistemological knowledge of a base of marginalized communities. So in my project, which I did, which was a qualitative intercultural Bible study project for about 5 years, where I had Black Christians and white Christians reading texts of forgiveness, the intention was to understand, what do these people know? I didn't want to go and read, you know, the 4 latest commentaries on Matthew 18 to try and solve the problem of the hermeneutics of forgiveness. I really wanted to see what power is there in finding different sources of knowledge to inform academic Bible scholarship. So just to conclude this section, I want to recommend to you a very interesting book. In fact, I believe it came out of a section of the SBL and maybe the AAR, but I think it was the SBL, called The Invention of the Biblical Scholar, a Critical Manifesto, because I think what it does is it unmasks our attachment to the power that is often associated with our training and the social and economic recognition that comes from being a professional Bible scholar. Okay, so that's the end of this first section. Right, after the pause, now let's move on to the second question, which is how do we transform Wesleyan and Methodist theological education by decentering dominant biblical scholarship and embracing minoritized hermeneutics and incorporating voices from the margins? Now, I think the first thing that we need to recognize, and this comes from our colleague Tanyiko Maluleke, is that Christian theology is not and has never been neutral, particularly when it comes to contexts such as our own. In South Africa, we have to recognize that the starting point of Black and African theologies is to look for and to expose the inside job in the continuing theological, spiritual, and physical burglary of Africa. And I think this is a very important thing. Now, the late South African theologian who passed away 3 years ago, Vuyani Velum, spoke of this project as unthinking the West. Now, what do I mean by unthinking the West? Well, the first thing I think is that we are reaching an epistemological break. Ndlovu Gacheni says that we are facing a crisis of Euro-American epistemology. So I can certainly say to you, those of us who live and work in Africa are finding that there is an epistemic break. We cannot any longer assume that somehow what we get from the West will solve all of the world's problems. But there's something even more important than that. Vuyani Velum states, I quote, "The West is not our creator." Unthinking the West, our position is that Western civilization can be overcome. It's crumbling as we speak. The poor and the marginalized, not Western civilization, constitute our future for the development of life-affirming alternatives to civilization and knowledge. Now, there are 3 specific things that I have suggested that we should do in order to unthink the West. The first thing that we need to do is we need to deal with the perverse logic of coloniality. Now, by this I mean the kind of work that persons like Frantz Fanon, the Algerian political philosopher, and Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela, the South African social psychologist, have advocated for. What we need to do is we need to undo the kind of racism, negrophobia, chauvinism, Afro-pessimism, white supremacism that captures so much of global biblical scholarship. And we need to recognize that there is not only value, but beauty in Black bodies that think about God and the Bible, and in contexts like those in South Africa. And we need to repair the damage which has been done by a psychology that othered people from their existence and that told them that they were not good enough. The second thing that I think we need to do is we need to deal with the soft power of epistemology, methodology, and language. Now, according to the Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the colonial powers not only sought to dehumanize and divide persons through the exercise of violence and political power, they also tried to use soft power to dominate people. In order to achieve the aims of domination and dehumanization, they malformed culture, they deconstructed language, they devalued art, and they devalued education. And so I think one of the ways in which we need to go about undoing the West, unthinking the West, is we need to centralize once again the experiences, the languages, the cultures of those who are not Western. We need to bring into biblical scholarship a kind of perspective that decenters the values of languages like English, for example, but also the kind of cultural imagination, sort of social imaginary that Charles Taylor speaks of, that imagines that the world operates in certain ways. For example, what do we think counts as value and knowledge? Whose work gets cited? What gets published? I often look at my students' bibliographies when they hand in a master's or a PhD thesis, and I tell them that we need just like we have broad-based Black economic empowerment in South Africa's economy, we need a strategy for empowerment for the voices that are often placed on the margins. So this is the third thing that I often speak about, and then I'm finished with the second point. I think that we need to deliberately center African reality and experience. As both Nokozulu Mdende and Tanyiko Maluleke have noted, we cannot proceed without taking seriously the continued and historic influence of African identity, African religiosity, and its shape upon Christianity and the world. Now, the neutralization of Euro-American hegemony is not enough to facilitate a truly contextually relevant and applicable form of decolonizing biblical scholarship. So this is where the work of people like Steve Biko and Dibanga wa Said come in, where we actually need to say that the hegemony of whiteness and Eurocentricity, the dominance of these paradigms in America, in Europe, and around the world lead to what we call a white God or a white theology. And much of the work that we are doing in the project of Africanization invites us to recenter our location, our lives, our experiences, and our work as not only valuable, but necessary in dealing with domination. So this is the end of my reflection on the second point. How can we do this? And I think we need more persons teaching these approaches to biblical scholarship. And we need to centralize them in our academic conferences, as you are doing here today. Thank you for this. But also to think about which are the publishers and who's being included and excluded, who gets valorized, who gets recognized, who gets celebrated in global biblical scholarship. Because I think as long as Western scholars build the kind of walls that keep scholars from elsewhere in the world out, as long as we valorize and tell people what we believe to be important and what's not important, it's going to be very difficult to undo this system. So that's my second point. Okay, the third point is how do we incorporate global perspectives on biblical interpretation to promote diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice? Now, before I answer this question, I would first like to problematize some of the language which is used here. Now, I've written about this elsewhere extensively, so I'm not going into great detail, but consider for a moment the power relations that are implicit in the language of diversity and inclusion. Now, of course, in some Western contexts where the dominant majority are white persons, this might go unnoticed. However, in South Africa, my students helped me to see the perversion of this kind of universal language. In South Africa, it is the white minority that occupies the center of power and privilege, and the black majority that are excluded. During the 2016 and 2017 student unrests, fees must fall and roads must fall on our campuses. The universities use this language of diversity and inclusion. Now, in that kind of diversity language, who are the diverse ones and who occupies the center? Who is not diverse must be the norm around which diversity is often constructed, and that's problematic. One can make a similar case about the notion of inclusion. For example, who needs to be included? In other words, who is already in the center and holds the power? And I think we need to think very carefully and courageously and question this kind of language. But there are four things that I want to suggest. Firstly, the invitation to decolonize and Africanize biblical scholarship will require that we are courageous and honest enough to maintain a healthy measure of self-critique. Who is hosting the conversation? Where is the conversation taking place? Who are the participants in the conversation? What is the nature of inquiry that's taking place? And of course, who is not present? What are we studying? What are we not studying? What do we regard as valuable? Second, we'll need to interrogate our unquestioned assumptions about what we believe to be true and right and necessary in our research. In this instance, we'll need to carefully consider how we conceive of what constitutes biblical scholarship. In what ways do we conceptualize our topics? Whose voices, experiences, and realities form what we tentatively call biblical scholarship? Which forms of belief and practice do we consider to form the core of our understanding? Thirdly, we are almost at the end. There may be some instances in which we confess our blindness and inadequacy by virtue of our social locations, histories, and identities. For example, I'm a white, male, English-speaking academic theologian who belongs to a historically colonial Christian tradition. The recognition of my own inadequacy may just open up some space for the voices of those who are not centered in my life to speak to me, and this will require that I'm willing to listen and learn. Fourthly, there may be some very important things that I will need to unlearn and unthink as this process unfolds. And I need to confess to you, siblings, this is not easy. I've invested my whole career, indeed my whole life, in developing the skills and capabilities that I have for academic research of a particular kind. And it's scary to think that some of what I've been doing may need to be unlearned. But if the intention is to work towards a truthful, responsible academic contribution that is relevant to the African context, then I'm going to need to muster the courage to do so. Thank you for listening today.